Have you ever noticed that peculiar moment when everything finally aligns, when the promotion comes through, when the relationship deepens, when recognition arrives, and something inside you begins to panic? That inexplicable urge to create chaos precisely when stability emerges. You pick fights with your supportive partner. You miss deadlines after the big promotion. You find ways to undermine the very success you've worked toward. Society calls this fear of success self-sabotage or imposter syndrome. But the answer lies somewhere deeper, somewhere more primordial, something that challenges everything we thought we understood about human motivation. Because when you disrupt your own happiness, you aren't simply damaged or afraid. You're experiencing what Freud identified as the most mysterious force in the human psyche, the death drive. And that recognition doesn't come with simple explanations or quick fixes. It comes with a profound confrontation with the divided nature of the human will, a psychological truth that most people spend their entire lives denying. No, you're not crazy. You're human. You're not ungrateful. You've simply encountered one of Freud's most disturbing insights, that alongside our drive toward pleasure, growth, and life, exists an equally powerful tendency toward dissolution, regression, and return to an earlier state. There's something profoundly revealing about this pattern of self-sabotage at moments of success, because that behavior shatters our illusion of straightforward motivation, dismantles our belief in simple progress, and reveals a brutal truth. Most of us are not simply moving toward growth, and most of us are still learning to recognize ourselves in that silent yet deafening mirror of unconscious self-destruction. Freud introduced his concept of the death drive, thanatos, late in his career, recognizing that the pleasure principle alone couldn't explain the human tendency toward repetitive self-defeat. And this mysterious compulsion to undermine ourselves when things go well is actually a manifestation of what he called the beyond of the pleasure principle. It's what many experience, but few have the courage to acknowledge. They don't examine the pattern of how success triggers self-destruction. They simply attribute it to coincidence. They don't question why stability often precedes chaos. They're less interested in psychological truth and more in maintaining a simpler narrative about human motivation. And that makes personal growth treacherous because while we consciously claim to seek happiness, something deeper has discovered the compelling pull toward what Freud identified as the organism's desire to return to an earlier, inorganic state. The person who sabotages themselves at moments of success isn't simply fearful. They're operating from a fundamental tension in the psyche, a structure where the life drive, eros, pushing toward growth and connection, exists in perpetual conflict with the death drive, thanatos, pulling toward disintegration and return, where conscious goals and unconscious resistance follow completely different trajectories. And maybe that's why it creates so much confusion, so much self-blame, so many attempts to rationalize behavior that fundamentally defies rational explanation. But what many still don't understand is that behind their seemingly inexplicable self-defeat is a psyche working exactly as Freud described, torn between opposing forces that operate largely beyond conscious control. You don't consciously choose to undermine your success. Your unconscious responds according to its own logic. And until you recognize this fundamental tension, you exist in a state of psychological bewilderment, mistaking conscious goals for the only drivers of your behavior. Maybe you don't recognize yourself in this right now. Maybe you think it's deterministic, extreme, or an oversimplification of your complex experience. But deep down, way deep down, there's a question inside you. A quiet one that pulses even when you try to ignore it. What if your tendency to disrupt your own happiness isn't a character flaw, but an expression of something Freud identified as universal to the human condition? A drive toward dissolution that exists alongside our drive toward life. The mysterious pattern of self-sabotage is not a personal failing. It's structure. And those who don't understand Freud's concept of the death drive often mistake psychological inevitability for moral weakness throughout their entire lives. But what few people see is that we don't create this contradictory pattern consciously. It emerges from the very structure of the psyche itself, where the pull toward life and the pull toward dissolution exist in perpetual tension. Freud believed that alongside our conscious striving exists an equally powerful unconscious tendency toward what he called the aim of all life, the return to an earlier state. And maybe that's why so many still find themselves inexplicably creating chaos at moments of success, disrupting relationships when they deepen, undermining achievements when they arrive, pulled by a force that their conscious mind would never deliberately choose, yet cannot seem to override. While most people claim their self-sabotage is simply fear of the unknown, the unconscious knows the profound tension between opposing drives. And there, in the midst of what we call inexplicable behavior, they've encountered not random self-defeat, but the fundamental ambivalence Freud identified at the core of human motivation. Early experiences when the pattern of disrupting positive states was first established, when their psyche encountered the complex interplay between the drive toward life and the equally powerful pull toward regression and return. Their pattern of self-sabotage didn't develop from conscious choice, but emerges from this primordial tension between what Freud called the two classes of instincts, those serving life and those pulling toward its opposite. This person knows moments of genuine alignment. They've experienced it. They've had periods where, briefly at least, their conscious goals and unconscious patterns seem to operate in harmony. But somehow, those moments of integration remain fleeting, repeatedly giving way to the familiar pattern where success triggers self-defeat and stability precedes chaos. And that pattern wasn't created randomly. It reflects the fundamental tension Freud identified between our drive toward greater complexity and connection, eros, and our equally powerful pull toward simplification and return, thanatos. What registered in their psychological development wasn't just the conscious message about what they should want, but the unconscious reality of this profound ambivalence. What emerged wasn't integration, but division. And that division becomes psychologically destabilizing because it combines the conscious pursuit of success with the unconscious pull toward its disruption, creating the perpetual pattern of achievement followed by self-sabotage. They don't want to disrupt their own happiness. They want to sustain success when it arrives. They're no longer acting based solely on conscious intention, but operating from the mysterious tension Freud identified between opposing drives. So maybe that's why their life history feels so contradictory to many observers, because it's not about conscious choice, but unconscious pattern. And that takes more than intellectual understanding to truly transform. It takes recognition of the profound ambivalence at the core of the psyche itself, where few are willing to acknowledge that alongside their drive toward life exists an equally powerful pull toward what Freud called the quiescence of the inorganic world. And that's where many growth efforts founder. Not because goals change, but because the initial conscious striving eventually encounters the powerful undertow of what Freud identified as the death drive, creating the perpetual cycle of progress followed by regression. They don't want to merely rationalize, they want to understand. Until then, they experience this pattern not by conscious choice, but out of psychological structures they didn't create but inherited from both evolutionary history and personal development. This person isn't damaged, they're divided. There's a vast difference between deliberate self-defeat and the unconscious expression of a fundamental psychic tension. But the world doesn't easily accept the complexity of this division. A world that still believes in straightforward motivation. A world that still assumes conscious intention should dictate behavior completely, as if the profound ambivalence Freud identified were a personal failing rather than a universal condition. Freud wrote, "The aim of all life is death," one of his most disturbing insights. But perhaps our greatest confusion comes not from the existence of this pull toward dissolution, but from denying it. And this person's pattern of self-sabotage doesn't operate by conscious choice. It follows the psyche's inherent structure. They hear phrases like, "Why do you always ruin things when they're going well? Why can't you just be happy? You need to stop getting in your own way." And inwardly, they understand the observation but feel powerless against the reality of their own pattern. Because they sense what many don't realize, that what Freud identified as the death drive isn't a personal pathology, but a universal aspect of the human condition, operating largely beyond conscious control. They're not looking for failure. They're experiencing the uncomfortable truth that something in them responds to success with profound ambivalence. Something that triggers not celebration, but discomfort, not satisfaction, but restlessness, not stability, but an inexplicable urge toward disruption. And let's be honest, that's not something you consciously choose, but unconsciously experience. The self-sabotage they enact isn't a deliberate rejection of happiness, but the natural outcome of a psyche where success activates what Freud identified as our tendency toward return and regression. They're living proof that the life drive and death drive often exist in tension rather than harmony. And that disrupts our cultural narratives. Simple motivation feels illusory. Straightforward progress seems perpetually undermined. But they aren't deliberately choosing this pattern. They're responding to a psychological tension that exists not by choice, but by structure. And the confusion they feel when stability triggers chaos is by itself a brutal indicator of how deeply divided the human psyche actually is between these opposing tendencies. This person isn't morally deficient by nature. They don't deliberately undermine themselves. They understand intellectually the appeal of sustained success and happiness. And for that, they carry a double burden, both the reality of their self-sabotaging pattern and the intellectual awareness that it contradicts what they consciously want. They desire achievement while something deeper triggers its disruption. They value connection while psychological conditioning pulls them toward behaviors that create distance. They long for stability while their actions reliably create the very chaos their conscious mind would never choose. And when they achieve something meaningful, it's not celebration they feel, but anxiety. The anxiety that precedes what Freud might recognize as the death drive asserting itself against the achievement of the life drive. When they find themselves inexplicably picking fights in an otherwise healthy relationship, it's not deliberate sabotage but psychic tension, the tension between opposing forces that Freud identified as fundamental to human motivation. When they miss important deadlines after a promotion, it's not ingratitude, but structure. The structure of a psyche where success activates regression. And that internal battle between conscious striving and unconscious resistance is their greatest struggle, because they don't consciously choose to undermine themselves. They're driven by psychological systems largely operating beyond awareness. And that divided self, between what they consciously pursue and what they unconsciously disrupt, is what makes their patterns so difficult to break through conscious intention alone. Perhaps what unsettles people most about this pattern isn't its irrationality. It's the uncomfortable truth it reveals about the nature of human motivation itself. Freud taught that civilization requires the renunciation of instinct, but what happens when the most disturbing instinct is one that pulls us toward our own undoing? It was precisely that question that exposes why success often triggers self-sabotage for those whose psyche operates exactly as Freud described. Divided between the life drive pushing toward greater complexity and the death drive pulling toward regression. It wasn't by choice. It was a psychological reality that emerged from both our evolutionary history and our personal development, where the tension between these opposing drives became established as the fundamental structure of motivation itself. They no longer experience their patterns through simple explanations alone. They're beginning to glimpse psychological complexity. And that changes everything. How many times have you wondered why you seem to create chaos precisely when things are going well? How many times have you felt confused by your own tendency to disrupt your happiness? This person has felt that too. They once thought there must be something fundamentally wrong with them for repeatedly undermining their own success. But one day they began to question whether what they were experiencing was personal pathology or psychological inevitability. And that day, they made the first step toward recognizing a pattern that had been invisible yet controlling their life completely. Their path toward integration is not a straight line. There are days of insight, moments of painful recognition, nights of wondering why they can't simply sustain success when it arrives. But there's also a growing clarity that illuminates what was once completely confusing. They learned that what they call self-sabotage often has very little to do with conscious intention at all. The mysterious tendency to disrupt their own happiness is not weakness, but structure. The contradictions they experience are not character flaws, but expressions of a psyche that operates exactly as Freud described, divided between opposing forces that create the perpetual cycle of progress, followed by regression. And until that fundamental tension is recognized, they choose to begin acknowledging, rather than simply denying their own psychological reality. Not out of resignation, but out of the necessity for genuine understanding. This person is the living embodiment of Freud's insight that the human psyche is fundamentally ambivalent. They've been shaped by both the life drive pushing toward greater complexity and the death drive pulling towards simplification and return, formed by a psychological structure that permanently established a tension between these opposing forces, pulled by systems so different that they create the perpetual experience of achievement followed by self-sabotage. And now that they're beginning to recognize the pattern, they face the monumental task of accepting rather than denying the divided nature of human motivation itself. They don't want just to pretend integration where tension exists. They want to understand how it shapes their cyclical pattern of success and self-defeat. That's challenging because it requires not just intellectual understanding, but psychological honesty. And sadly, few undertake this difficult journey. Most still mistake the death drive for personal weakness, psychological ambivalence for character flaw, structural inevitability for deliberate choice. And if they still find themselves sabotaging success today, it's because every instance reflects the fundamental tension Freud identified. Every experience of achievement they attain activates not just satisfaction but its opposite, the unconscious pull toward disruption that operates according to the logic of the death drive. Every relationship they deepen triggers not just connection, but the countering force, the tendency toward separation that Freud recognized as the death drive working against the life drive. They're beginning to see the pattern without yet knowing how to transform it. And that awareness born from honest self-observation changes their relationship to their own behavior. Because a person who has glimpsed the profound ambivalence at the core of their motivation becomes psychologically awakened. Not because the tension immediately resolves, but because they've begun to see what was previously attributed to personal failing. The person who finds themselves inexplicably self-sabotaging when things go well is not making a moral error. Something inside them is structured exactly as Freud described. And it was precisely that structure that created both their contradictory patterns and the potential for their eventual integration. Because sometimes only in recognizing tension can we begin the long process of genuine acceptance. Freud suggested that making the unconscious conscious doesn't eliminate psychic conflict, but makes it bearable through understanding. And that's exactly what they've begun to undertake. They're reconnecting with how motivation actually operates, facing the reality of how profoundly the psyche is divided between opposing drives, patterns that weren't chosen but emerged from the very structure of psychological development itself. They disrupted unconscious pattern by making it conscious. They began questioning what they thought was a personal failing, not by becoming self-indulgent, but by becoming psychologically honest. They learned that their tendency to sabotage success wasn't a deliberate rejection of happiness, but a natural expression of what Freud identified as the death drive, operating largely outside conscious control. And when they stopped simply blaming themselves, they began the more nuanced work of truly seeing the pattern clearly. First with confusion, then with recognition, and finally with the acceptance necessary for any genuine integration. Because someone who has seen the profound ambivalence at the core of their motivation no longer mistakes psychological structure for moral failing quite so readily. They learn to notice the tension between their conscious goals and unconscious resistance, to honor the reality of their psyche while not being completely controlled by it. They're not instantly transformed. They simply no longer act completely unconsciously. There's a world of difference between blind confusion and pattern observed with growing clarity. They still feel the contradiction between what they consciously pursue and the self-sabotage that follows achievement, yes, but they've begun to recognize it as structure rather than weakness. Not with self-judgment or harsh criticism, but with the curious attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand rather than simply continue fighting their own psychological reality. Their awareness has become an ally rather than an enemy. Their recognition is a new capacity. They can begin to distinguish between the life drive pushing toward greater complexity and the death drive pulling toward regression. And they don't hesitate to question what once seemed like evidence of their own moral failing. Their transformation isn't immediate, it's gradual. It's as if they've tapped into an ancient understanding, an old wisdom that humans aren't destined to perpetually mistake psychic ambivalence for character flaw, but can, through awareness, begin to accept rather than deny the complex nature of motivation itself. Not to surrender aspiration, but to recognize its complex relationship with unconscious resistance. And in accessing that understanding, something awakens in them, a psychological honesty, emotional maturity, a person who, though still divided in the way Freud described, is no longer completely confused by it. They're in communion with something greater, with the possibility of integration through acceptance rather than denial. And no matter how deeply established the tension between the life drive and death drive, nothing remains completely confusing when illuminated by genuine self-awareness. They no longer simply blame themselves for their patterns. They observe them with growing clarity. They're no longer helplessly confused by the contradiction between their conscious goals and their unconscious self-sabotage. They do the psychological work. And that shift from unconscious confusion to conscious recognition changes everything about their relationship to success and self-defeat. But they're no longer identified completely with either their conscious striving or their unconscious resistance. They've already begun to see beyond simplistic narratives, and in that seeing, they discovered that integration might look completely different from what they imagined. Not the elimination of psychic tension, but its conscious recognition. There's something profound about the way they now approach their patterns. They don't need to deny the profound ambivalence at the core of the psyche. Their awareness is expanding, and it's in that expansion that their true freedom lives. Freud suggested that consciousness doesn't resolve psychic conflict, but makes it bearable. And perhaps that's why this person, in choosing to understand, rather than simply deny, has become someone capable of eventually navigating rather than being blindly controlled by the tension between opposing drives. They no longer try to simply blame themselves for undermining their own success or convince anyone that they should be different. They don't deny the reality of their ambivalence because they've learned that psychological patterns clarify not through moralization, but through recognition. And when they feel that familiar urge to self-sabotage after achievement, they now pause. They don't engage in self-recrimination or denial. They observe with the dignity of someone who's experienced this pattern enough times to recognize its inevitability. What few people understand is that this person still pursues growth and connection. They still value achievement, intimacy, and stability. But they want to understand why these achievements so reliably trigger the countering force that Freud identified as the death drive. They want this understanding not to surrender aspiration, but to move toward greater integration between conscious goals and unconscious resistance. Now, they only offer themselves where there's the possibility for both achievement and its conscious maintenance, and that requires a level of maturity that goes far beyond conventional success. It requires self-awareness. It requires having faced one's own psychological contradictions and still choosing to evolve beyond simple narratives. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for integration, an approach to life where there's both conscious pursuit of growth and recognition of the unconscious resistance that inevitably accompanies it, where success becomes sustainable not through denial of the death drive, but through its conscious inclusion in their understanding. And if that seems more complex than the simple motivational narratives they've known, perhaps that's precisely the point, because they'd rather find genuine integration than continue mistaking psychological ambivalence for personal failing. And to many still caught in that confusion, that sounds like resignation. But it's really just psychological honesty in its purest form. If something inside you was touched by this exploration, maybe it's because deep down you too are ready to examine the profound ambivalence at the core of your motivation. A contradiction that begins with honoring the divided nature of the psyche itself. A relationship with yourself that acknowledges both the life drive pushing toward greater complexity and the death drive pulling toward regression without reducing either to moral judgment. A clarity that can't be achieved through simplistic self-help alone, but must emerge from increasing psychological honesty. And if that clarity hasn't fully arrived yet, maybe it's because you first needed to recognize that what feels like a personal failing might actually be the very structure of motivation that Freud identified, something worth understanding rather than simply judging. And if this message found you at the right moment, or awakened something you forgot was living inside you, then share it with others who might be silently struggling with the same pattern of self-sabotage at moments of success. Because when something illuminates the soul, the least we can do is let it keep shining within us and through us.